Wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to use the passive, or we had some alternatives that we could use to make things a bit easier, or even for a bit of advanced variety? Well, you're in luck, because today I've got 4 or maybe even 5 alternatives to the passive, ranging from relatively easy through to a lot more advanced. Grüß Gott, hallo, ich bin Billy Badger und das ist Bausteine 3. Herzlich willkommen. So we've got maybe 5 alternatives to the passive, but first let's make sure we know what the passive looks like and what it is that we're trying to replace. Now, we're not going to go too deep here because, of course, the goal after all is to avoid the passive. So let's look at a sentence like this. Eine Frage wurde gestellt. We know what's happened. We do know a question has been asked, but we don't know who asked it. Normally, we'd be saying someone asked a question. Jemand hat eine Frage gestellt. But maybe we don't know who it was. We just know that somebody asked a question. So it's actually pretty handy. In the passive, the action is described by a participle form of the verb right at the end of the clause, and in the second position is an appropriate form of the verb werden. The question was being asked in the past, and it was just one question, so we are using wurde. But if it had been 2 questions, then we could have said zwei Fragen wurden gestellt. If maybe you prefer the 2-part past tense, if this is you, then you're more likely to say zwei Fragen sind gestellt worden, with that unusual participle form worden on the end. If this is something happening right now, then it makes sense to say zwei Fragen werden gestellt. It's worth pointing out here, of course, that what we're describing is a process. In German, it's really called das Vorgangspassiv, and that's more obvious in examples like this. Wird das Haus noch gebaut? Where we're asking, is the house still being built? In our response, we could either answer, ja, das Haus wird noch gebaut. This is the Vorgangspassiv. But if it's finished, then we could answer, nein, das Haus ist schon fertig gebaut. This is our Zustandspassiv because we're describing a state. The house is already finished. But we're interested in alternatives. So let's look at the first and I think the easiest one. Let's start with a different example. In Australien wird links gefahren. Also nicht wie in Deutschland, wo rechts gefahren wird. Now, it makes sense to use the passive because we don't know the names of all of those people who are driving on the left-hand side of the road in Australia, but we could use an indefinite pronoun to represent all of the people who drive on the left. And this is man. Man fährt links in Australien. And this is easier, isn't it? Because you're just using a normal sentence structure of subject followed by verb. And it's a bit like saying you drive on the left in Australia. This is an indefinite pronoun. It's not a noun and it's not gendered, even though it sounds a bit like it might be. It works best for general rules, habits, and impersonal statements. Maybe forms are filled out online only. Instead of Formulare werden online ausgefüllt, we could say Formulare füllt man online aus. Or maybe you're not meant to park somewhere from, say, 8 a.m. onwards. Ab 8 wird hier nicht geparkt. Would be a nice way to express this in the passive, but we could change it into an active sentence with the same focus on the action, not on the person carrying it out. Ab 8 parkt man hier nicht. But let's move on to something I think a little bit more advanced. Let's take this situation. You're talking about a book in German and you want to say it would be easy for beginners to understand. Well, in the passive, you could say, das Buch kann von Anfängern leicht gelesen werden. That's our passive with a modal verb, but there's an easier way to say it. Das Buch liest sich leicht. If we need to add the bit about beginners, then we could say, für Anfänger liest sich das Buch leicht. Maybe you're thinking at this stage, well, this is all pretty easy, then dieses Thema kann leicht verstanden werden. That's in the passive, but we could use a similar alternative for this as well. Das Thema versteht sich leicht. Or maybe you're doing a puzzle. Not so easy, perhaps this one. Das Rätsel kann nicht leicht gelöst werden. That's in the passive, but more simply, we can use this form. Das Rätsel löst sich nicht leicht. This is nice and concise because we do away with the modal verb and the passive, and it's really handy to have if you're describing particularly how easy or hard something is. And actually, what we're doing here, I think, is describing an inherent property or tendency of the object. If you say, for example, der Kuchen backt sich leicht, then we're not involving the baker at all in this sentence. It's a bit like saying the cake turns out easily when baked. While we're on the topic of modals and the passive, let's look at what is probably a more universally useful way of talking about something that can be done. Here's our situation. You've maybe found a recipe for, let's say, a Sachertorte. Now, if you're not sure what this is, think of chocolate and lots of it. It's pretty easy to make, so we might say, man kann den Kuchen leicht backen. Or if we're going to put this in the passive, der Kuchen kann leicht gebacken werden. Which is a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? Or maybe, as we had above, we could say, der Kuchen backt sich leicht. But we could also say, der Kuchen lässt sich leicht backen, which I think is a more obvious way to indicate the ease with which something can be done and how easily someone could do it. The ability here is the key. So similarly, we might have these examples of the passive that focus on an ability. So, das ist eine Krankheit, die nicht geheilt werden kann. Wien ist eine Stadt, die gut zu Fuß erkundet werden kann. Das Museum kann leicht gefunden werden. Deutsch kann schnell gelernt werden. All of these focus on the action and less on the person or the people carrying out the action. Let's replace the passive with this new form so that we're focusing on someone's ability to do certain things. Das ist eine Krankheit, die sich nicht heilen lässt. Wien ist eine Stadt, die sich gut zu Fuß erkunden lässt. Das Museum lässt sich leicht finden. Deutsch lässt sich schnell lernen, all of which may or may not, of course, be true. But while we're at it, let's think about a structure that we looked at in our last video. And it's a nice way, I think, of talking about things that can be done or even must be done. And the particular meaning will depend on the context. Remember our example about learning German. Deutsch kann leicht gelernt werden, or with our indefinite pronoun, this would be Deutsch kann man leicht lernen. Or this would work with a reflexive form of the verb as well. Deutsch lernt sich leicht. And we could use lassen as well, the reflexive form at least. Deutsch lässt sich leicht lernen. Let's try the same thing with an infinitive phrase. Deutsch ist leicht zu lernen, which, if you think about it, is much the way that we could say this in English as well. German is easy to learn. Let's get some examples before the video gets, well, just too long. Maybe you're still looking for the museum. Our active sentence would be, man kann das Museum nicht finden. Passive version might be, das Museum kann nicht gefunden werden. Or with a reflexive verb, das Museum findet sich nicht leicht. Or with a reflexive form of lassen, das Museum lässt sich nicht leicht finden. Or simply with our infinitive phrase, which is maybe even more idiomatically fitting, das Museum ist nicht leicht zu finden. But sometimes the same thing describes what we have to do or what has to be done. Maybe you've got a bill to pay. In these sorts of formal situations, the people like to use the passive. Die Rechnung muss umgehend beglichen werden. It's got to be paid straight away. Using sein and an infinitive phrase in this context expresses the imperative, I think, very clearly without being too direct or personal. Die Rechnung ist umgehend zu begleichen. So let's take another example and run through as many of our alternatives as we can. We're going to be thinking about maybe picking up a hire car, and we can do this from 9 o'clock onwards. I think the only form that doesn't really make sense in this context is the reflexive form of the verb. I don't think it makes sense to say der Mietwagen holt sich ab 9 ab. This is going to be more useful when talking about things that are easy or hard, but different forms will make better sense in different situations. If you want to emphasize who's picking the car up, then we can use an active form, either wir können ab 9 den Mietwagen abholen, or even man kann ab 9 den Mietwagen abholen. Either of these are okay. It makes a little less sense to use lassen. I think das Auto lässt sich ab 9 abholen, but this would be fine, I guess, if you want to emphasize an ability. Our infinitive phrase is perhaps the easiest of all to use. Der Mietwagen ist ab 9 abzuholen. So lots of different possibilities. Which one we're going to use, I think, depends on the context. Das Passiv lässt sich also gut vermeiden. Man muss es nicht immer verwenden. Infinitivsätze sind leicht und praktisch zu formulieren. Und wenn es darum geht, dass sich etwas leicht oder schwer machen lässt, bieten sich unsere reflexiven Formen als nützliche Alternativen. Wie immer muss man nur ein bisschen üben. Übungen finden sich unten in der Videobeschreibung. Also danke fürs Zuschauen, alles Gute, frohes Neues, auf Wiedersehen und tschüss.
Tschüss.